The first letter arrived in an envelope heavier than usual. I noticed it immediately, cream-colored, embossed with the family crest. My mother's hand had always been precise, delicate, even when frail. This envelope felt different. It felt calculated. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed and signed by her lawyer. Dear Emily, your mother has requested an updated copy of her will. Please review the enclosed documents at your earliest convenience. I set it down carefully, as if touching it too quickly would shatter something fragile. I had spent years caring for her, feeding her, guiding her, staying awake when she couldn't sleep, absorbing her every need. And my brother Matthew, he had spent years away, only to return now, smiling, charming, and insistent. The day I had learned of the new will, the air in the house had changed. Matthew lingered at her side, whispering, holding her hand, his eyes glinting with a subtle triumph I could not ignore. The document, unsigned by my mother yet prepared under her direction, favored him. And just like that, my years of sacrifice seemed invisible, erased with a bureaucratic stroke. I didn't react immediately. I never reacted immediately. My mother's health was failing. I couldn't afford rash decisions or emotional outbursts. That would have been easy. Instead, I took notes, remembered conversations, and cataloged every slight, every opportunity, every detail of the estate. For the next few days, I moved like a shadow through the house. I fed her, bathed her, read aloud to her, and when Matthew hovered too close, I offered polite smiles and empty conversation. All the while, I made plans. It was slow work. It required patience, observation, and timing. Small moves first, correcting errors in accounting, ensuring receipts and ledgers were meticulously filed, noting every promise Matthew had made and forgotten. The lawyer called again one afternoon, reminding me that the will would be finalized within a week. I nodded calmly, as if agreeing to a trivial errand. Inside, I felt a quiet thrill. The stage was set. Late at night, when the house was silent except for the occasional wheeze from my mother's room, I began cataloging everything Matthew had taken for granted. My mother's trust, the household accounts, the minor details of her care that no one else had noticed. Every bill, every legal document, every letter could be wielded, not in violence, but in bureaucracy, in the quiet, devastating language of inheritance. I called it my ledger of quiet justice. When the day came to review the final version of the will, I sat in the lawyer's office, calm, composed, and unnoticed. Matthew was there, leaning against the polished oak table, smirking. The lawyer cleared his throat, arranging the papers in front of us. Mrs. Langley has made her decisions carefully, he said. Please review and sign when ready. I skimmed the pages, noting the discrepancies, the changes, the favors granted to him, and the subtle oversights. Those were my weapons. No one would see them coming until they were enforced. I signed the document, not out of submission, but as part of a larger strategy. Every act now became a chain reaction. Tiny adjustments in accounts, legal challenges, and delayed notices that would slowly, elegantly, shift the inheritance in ways Matthew could not anticipate. When we returned home, I carried my mother's hand in mine. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment, trusting me as she always had. And in that trust, I found my power, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through patience, precision, and the slow, deliberate application of knowledge. Matthew smiled at me, confident, unaware that the game had just begun, and I had all the time in the world. The days after the will's signing were quiet, almost painfully so. Matthew strutted through the house as if the world now belonged to him, blissfully unaware that his perceived victory was already teetering on invisible foundations. I didn't confront him. I never needed to. Power, I had learned, didn't demand noise. It demanded patience. The first move came in the form of a ledger. I spent hours cross-referencing the household accounts, noting inconsistencies that no one else would question. A forgotten bill here, a misallocated fund there. Each tiny error would compound. I made adjustments quietly, through phone calls, letters, and careful documentation, ensuring that every financial decision reflected my subtle influence rather than his. Matthew noticed nothing. Next, I began organizing my mother's medical records. Simple, seemingly benign adjustments. Dates clarified, notes highlighted, instructions for disbursements annotated. I added careful remarks for the lawyers and accountants, highlighting areas that required immediate attention or clarification. Every suggestion seemed helpful, collaborative, even sisterly. But beneath each annotation lay a trap: delays, questions, and corrections that slowly chipped away at Matthew's assumed control. At home, I kept up appearances. I prepared meals for my mother, managed her medications, and spent quiet evenings reading to her. Each act reminded him, and anyone who might watch, that I was indispensable. Yet my outward calm hid the storm I orchestrated behind the scenes. One afternoon, a letter arrived for Matthew. I had discreetly arranged it through our lawyer. The notice contained minor corrections to account allocations, requiring his signature. By the time he realized the subtle mistakes, weeks had passed. The oversight, which seemed trivial, already created small delays in payments he had assumed he could spend freely. He fumed privately, but had no immediate recourse. Every action he took to rectify the situation only deepened the bureaucratic labyrinth I had constructed. I smiled quietly when I observed the first cracks. Matthew's confidence began to waver. His visits to the lawyer became frequent and anxious. He started keeping meticulous records, double-checking receipts, and questioning every minor suggestion. And yet no one suspected me. I was patient, composed, always helpful, always in the right place at the right time. Then came the emotional leverage. I began to subtly remind my mother of the sacrifices I had made for her. Not with complaints, but in moments of quiet care. A hand held a little longer, a smile of understanding, a gentle correction to something Matthew overlooked. "You've been so wonderful," she said one evening, her frail hand resting on mine. "I don't know what I would do without you." Her words were a quiet vindication, a subtle warning to Matthew that influence cannot be purchased or assumed. It is earned through loyalty and presence. The weeks turned into months. Each minor bureaucratic adjustment, each nudge of responsibility, created small ripples that disrupted Matthew's carefully constructed assumptions. I never acted out of anger, only strategy. Every move was calculated to protect what my mother had entrusted to me, while revealing, piece by piece, that control is never absolute. By the time the estate was fully assessed and bills finalized, Matthew realized, too late, that the power he thought he had inherited was illusionary. I had allowed him to think himself in control, while I quietly guided every step. And all the while, my mother's health waned. She was unaware of the machinations, but her trust in me, her constant reliance, had fortified my position. In the end, the quiet, deliberate patience, the invisible moves of strategy, were my greatest weapon. Matthew never saw the storm coming. By the time the estate's details were fully circulating among lawyers and accountants, Matthew's confidence had begun to fray. What he had believed to be his victory, a rewritten will, favoring him above all, was slowly crumbling under the quiet pressure I had orchestrated. I didn't need to confront him. The beauty of my plan was in its subtlety. Bureaucracy, patience, and calculated timing were more lethal than anger or confrontation. The first significant move came when I discovered a discrepancy in a minor investment my mother had made decades ago, a fund Matthew assumed he controlled entirely. I contacted the firm quietly, requesting clarification on several small transactions. Nothing overtly threatening, just procedural questions, requests for documentation, and subtle flags that required his attention. By the time the firm replied, weeks had passed. Matthew, blindsided by delays, began to show irritation in ways that were visible to all around him. A quick temper, forced smiles, and restless pacing replaced the arrogance he had worn like armor. Next, I leveraged family oversight. Cousins, aunts, and uncles had always considered me meticulous, reliable, and discreet. I invited them to review minor household accounts and estate allocations for transparency, framing it as collaboration, not challenge. Every observation they made validated the subtle shifts I had already implemented, while planting seeds of doubt in Matthew's mind. He began to lose his narrative control. Every casual comment from family members reminded him that his power was not absolute. Even those closest to him began to whisper about inconsistencies, small delays, and missed details, all orchestrated quietly by my hand. At home, I continued my performance of loyalty and care. My mother's health was fragile. Every meal, medication, and visit was executed flawlessly. Matthew attempted to assert authority, but his suggestions often contradicted her preferences. I subtly guided her choices, ensuring her voice and will remained intact, her trust in me unshaken. "You've always been reliable, Emily," she said one evening, her hand resting on mine. "I can see everything in your eyes. You understand the consequences of every decision." Her words were a quiet triumph, more satisfying than any confrontation could ever be. Then came the final, decisive phase of my strategy: controlled revelations. I began sending carefully worded letters, emails, and notes to the family lawyer, highlighting overlooked bequests, forgotten debts, and obligations Matthew had neglected. Each document was procedural, polite, and factual, yet each carried subtle consequences. Payments delayed, allocations questioned, signatures required. Slowly, Matthew's assumed control unraveled. He grew frantic, calling meetings with lawyers, demanding explanations, attempting to assert dominance. But every avenue I had opened was airtight. Every move he made to regain control only tightened the invisible net around him. One evening, as the sun set and painted the study in warm amber light, I watched Matthew for the first time truly recognize the power I wielded. He paced the room, clutching letters and spreadsheets, eyes darting like a trapped animal. "You," he began, voice tight. "How?" I smiled faintly. "Patience, attention, and loyalty, Matthew. Things you never cultivated." He sank into a chair, defeated but silent. There was no anger left, only realization. Control cannot be assumed, it must be earned. And I had earned it quietly, deliberately, with every calculated move, every invisible adjustment, and every act of service unnoticed. By the end of the month, the estate was finalized. Every account balanced, every allocation verified, every subtle advantage secured. Matthew retained what was legally his, but the power he believed he had inherited, the influence, the control, the perception, was gone. I had transformed grief into strategy, betrayal into precision. Every bureaucratic act, every careful note, and every quiet intervention had reshaped the inheritance, not with noise, not with conflict, but with unassailable patience. My mother, though weakened, was safe in her final days. She never knew the full depth of the battles fought on her behalf. She only knew that her daughter had been attentive, careful, and unwavering, and that was enough. The house was quiet now, save for the soft ticking of the clock in the hall. My mother had passed peacefully a week ago, her hand resting in mine as she drifted into sleep that would not end. Her breath had slowed, then stopped, leaving a silence filled with memory, grief, and quiet satisfaction. Matthew sat in the study, poring over papers, but I noticed the tension in his shoulders, the strain in his hands. He had expected victory, yet all along control had slipped from his grasp. He had inherited wealth, yes, but not the influence, the respect, or the authority he assumed would accompany it. I approached him calmly, a letter in my hand. It was a minor clarification from the accountant, nothing confrontational, simply factual, procedural. Yet I knew it would trigger another cascade of delayed decisions, reallocations, and confirmations that would keep him occupied far longer than he anticipated. He looked up at me, eyes sharp, but tinged with defeat. "Emily, how did you—" I smiled faintly, folding the letter neatly. "Patience, observation, and consistency. Things you never cultivated." He said nothing more. His silence was louder than any argument. Over the next few weeks, I quietly settled the estate, ensuring that every small act of administration, every allocation, and every legal requirement fell into place exactly as it should. Matthew remained technically in charge of portions he had been granted, but every procedural step reminded him that oversight required skill, attention, and reliability, not just entitlement. Even distant relatives noticed the shift. Invitations, letters, and meetings were now carefully managed by me. Those who had once assumed Matthew's dominance began consulting me, seeking advice, clarification, and reassurance. The quiet power I had amassed was unassailable precisely because it had been earned without conflict. I took solace in my mother's trust, her final words echoing in my mind. "Emily, you understand the weight of responsibility. You are steady even when others falter. Remember that loyalty and care are their own kind of power." Her voice lingered like a warm presence, validating every calculated act, every quiet adjustment I had made in the shadows. Matthew's frustration, though restrained, was evident. He moved through the house cautiously, avoiding unnecessary confrontation, aware that his sister's control over the estate and family trust was absolute. Every attempt he made to assert authority, whether over bills, property, or family decisions, was quietly neutralized by meticulous planning and bureaucratic procedure. I never gloatingly reminded him of his failures. That would have been unnecessary. The realization itself was enough. In the end, victory was silent. It was procedural. It was subtle. It came not from confrontation or loud declarations, but from steady presence, careful documentation, and unwavering attention to detail. As I closed the final ledger, setting it aside, I felt a quiet satisfaction. My mother's legacy was intact. My sacrifices had been acknowledged in ways Matthew could never claim. The estate, the family's trust, and the intangible respect that comes from diligence and care were now mine to steward. I walked through the house one last time, memories of caregiving and subtle strategy blending into a single thread of accomplishment. The battles had been fought without noise, without malice, and without violation. Grief had been transformed into precision. Betrayal had been met with patience and insight. Power, real power, had been quietly and thoroughly reclaimed. And as I stepped outside into the crisp morning light, I realized that true victory did not demand spectacle. It required only focus, patience, and the willingness to act when others underestimated you. Matthew would remember this for the rest of his life, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, unyielding authority I had exercised in every small, devastating act of inheritance. Some wars are fought in silence. Some victories leave no scars. And this, my calculated, patient, unspoken revenge, was perfect.